Welcome to Untold Reality Daily. Today we explore one of the most important and controversial chapters in world history. The story of how the West colonized Africa. This is not a folklore tale. It is a real historical journey filled with ambition, betrayal, resistance, and survival. Long before European empires arrived with guns, ships, and treaties, Africa was already home to powerful kingdoms, advanced trade networks, and complex societies. From the rich empires of West Africa to the trading states of East Africa, the continent was alive with culture, knowledge, and economic power. African civilizations had rulers, armies, scholars, farmers, and traders who connected distant regions through trade routes that crossed deserts and oceans. Gold, ivory, salt, cloth, spices, and other valuable goods moved through these networks. Kingdoms such as Mali, Songhai, Benin, and Congo were respected powers in their regions. Their rulers managed territories, built cities, and maintained diplomatic relations with foreign merchants. However, beginning in the late 1500s and growing stronger during the 1600s and 1700s, European interest in Africa slowly began to change. At first, Europeans came mainly as traders along the coast. They built small trading posts where goods could be exchanged. These posts were controlled by merchants from countries such as Portugal, Britain, France, and the Netherlands. Initially, these foreigners depended heavily on African leaders who controlled the land and the trade routes. European traders could not simply move inland without permission from local rulers. African kings negotiated trade agreements and demanded taxes or gifts from the foreign merchants who wished to do business on their shores. But over time, the relationship began to change. European nations grew stronger, and their technology advanced rapidly. Their ships became larger and more powerful. Their weapons became more deadly. At the same time, industrial growth in Europe created a strong demand for raw materials such as rubber, cotton, palm oil, and minerals. Factories needed resources to feed the growing machines of the industrial age. European leaders began to look at Africa not just as a trading partner, but as a territory that could be controlled and exploited. This shift in thinking marked the beginning of a dangerous transformation. During the 1800s, European explorers began to travel deeper into the African interior. Some of them claimed to be scientists or missionaries. Others described themselves as explorers seeking knowledge. Among the most famous explorers was Henry Morton Stanley, who traveled through Central Africa, mapping rivers and regions that Europeans previously knew very little about. Another famous figure was David Livingstone, who moved across southern and Central Africa while spreading Christianity and reporting his journeys to European audiences. Their reports fascinated readers back in Europe. Newspapers published dramatic stories about unknown lands, powerful rivers, and vast natural wealth waiting to be discovered. These stories created excitement, but also greed. European politicians and businessmen began to imagine enormous profits if they could control these lands. By the 1870s, the competition between European powers had become intense. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, and Italy all wanted influence in Africa. Each nation feared that its rivals might claim valuable territories first. The pressure to expand became stronger each year. At the center of this competition was a controversial European ruler named Leopold II. Leopold had a powerful vision. He wanted to create a massive personal empire in Central Africa. To achieve this goal, he hired explorers like Henry Morton Stanley to travel deep into the Congo Basin and sign treaties with local chiefs. Many African leaders did not fully understand the documents they were signing. Some believed they were simply agreeing to trade partnerships or friendship agreements. But in reality, those papers were being used in Europe to claim ownership of enormous territories. This manipulation laid the foundation for one of the most brutal colonial regimes in history. Meanwhile, European leaders realized that the competition for Africa could lead to war between their countries. To prevent conflict, they decided to hold a major meeting that would determine how Africa would be divided among them. This meeting became known as the Berlin Conference. The conference began in the year 1884 and continued into 1885. Leaders and representatives from several European powers gathered in Berlin under the leadership of German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. The purpose of the conference was to create rules for claiming African territory. Shockingly, no African rulers were invited to participate. The fate of an entire continent was being decided without the presence of the people who actually lived there. During the conference, European powers agreed that any nation could claim African land if it demonstrated effective control over that territory. This agreement triggered what historians later called the Scramble for Africa. European nations rushed to send soldiers, administrators, and settlers into African regions in order to claim land before their rivals could do so. Maps were drawn with straight lines cutting across traditional territories, rivers, and ethnic boundaries. These borders ignored the complex social structures that already existed among African societies. Communities that had lived peacefully for generations suddenly found themselves divided between different colonial administrations. The scramble moved quickly. Within a few decades, most of the continent had been claimed by European empires. Britain controlled large territories from Egypt to South Africa. France expanded across West and Central Africa. Belgium seized control of the Congo. Germany claimed regions in East and Southwest Africa. Portugal held territories in Angola and Mozambique. Italy attempted to establish control in parts of East Africa. For African societies, the arrival of colonial rule brought dramatic changes. European administrators introduced new laws, forced labor systems, and taxation policies. Traditional leadership structures were often weakened or replaced. Colonial authorities demanded resources such as rubber, minerals, and agricultural products to feed European industries. In many regions, resistance quickly began. African leaders and communities fought to defend their lands and independence. Some wars were short, others lasted many years. But the balance of power had shifted. European armies possessed advanced rifles, machine guns, and artillery that gave them a devastating advantage. Despite these difficulties, African resistance never fully disappeared. Leaders emerged who refused to accept foreign domination. Their stories of courage would later inspire independence movements across the continent. The colonization of Africa was therefore not simply a story of conquest. It was also a story of resilience and struggle. The events that began during the late 1800s would shape Africa's political and economic future for generations. The borders created during this period still exist today, influencing modern nations and conflicts. Understanding this history helps us understand the world we live in now. The story of how the West colonized Africa is complex and filled with difficult truths. It reveals the powerful forces of ambition, greed, and political competition that drove European empires to claim control over vast territories far from their own shores. But it also reveals the strength of African societies that struggle to protect their land, culture, and freedom. In the chapters ahead, we will explore the dramatic expansion of colonial rule, the brutal systems of exploitation that followed, and the resistance movements that challenged European dominance. The story will take us through battles, political intrigue, and moments of courage that changed the course of history. The decisions made during the Berlin Conference did not immediately bring soldiers to every corner of Africa, but they created a powerful signal across Europe. The message was simple. Africa was now open for conquest. European governments, merchants, and military. Leaders rushed to claim territory before their rivals could do the same. What followed was one of the fastest and most dramatic land grabs in human history. Within just a few decades, nearly the entire African continent had been divided among foreign empires. Before this moment, Europeans mostly stayed along the coastline. They depended on African traders to bring goods from the interior. Now that strategy changed completely. European armies began moving inland with rifles, machine guns, and steam-powered boats that allowed them to travel up major rivers such as the Congo and the Niger. At the same time, European governments sent administrators, missionaries, engineers, and businessmen who were tasked with turning African territories into profitable colonies. One of the most brutal examples of this expansion happened in Central Africa under the control of Leopold II. Leopold had successfully convinced the European leaders that he wanted to create a humanitarian project in the Congo region. He claimed that his mission was to stop slavery and bring civilization and Christianity to Central Africa. In reality, Leopold had very different plans. He secretly turned the region into his personal property. This territory became known as the Congo Free State. Despite the name, there was nothing free about it. Leopold and his agents created a harsh system of forced labor that required African communities to gather huge amounts of rubber from the forests. Rubber had become extremely valuable because factories in Europe and America needed it to produce tires, machinery belts, and electrical equipment. Villages were ordered to meet strict rubber collection quotas. If they failed to meet those quotas, soldiers punished them severely. The soldiers who enforced these rules were known as the Force Publique, a colonial army created to maintain control. Many soldiers were forced recruits themselves, commanded by European officers. They were ordered to terrorize villages in order to force the population to work harder. Entire communities were taken hostage. Men were forced into the forests to collect rubber sap, while their wives and children were held captive. The punishments were horrific. Villages that failed to produce enough rubber were burned. People were beaten, tortured, and sometimes killed as an example to others. One of the most disturbing practices involved cutting off the hands of victims to prove that soldiers had used their bullets to kill people instead of wasting ammunition while hunting animals. News of these atrocities slowly began to reach Europe and the United States through missionaries and journalists. One of the men who helped expose these crimes was Roger Casement. His investigation revealed shocking evidence of brutality and exploitation in the Congo. Public outrage grew, and eventually international pressure forced Leopold to give up his personal control of the territory. In the year 1908, the Belgian government officially took over the Congo. Although some reforms were introduced, the damage done during Leopold's rule had already caused immense suffering. While Belgium was expanding in Central Africa, other European powers were aggressively claiming territory across the continent. France began extending its control across large parts of West and Central Africa. French colonial forces moved from coastal areas into the interior, capturing towns and forcing local rulers to sign treaties that placed their lands under French authority. Many of these treaties were signed under pressure or deception. Local leaders often believed they were forming alliances, not surrendering sovereignty. Britain also expanded rapidly. British officials were especially interested in controlling trade routes and key strategic regions. One of their major goals was to connect territories from North Africa to Southern Africa under British influence. This vision later became known as the Cape to Cairo concept. British colonies appeared in areas such as Egypt, Sudan, Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. In southern Africa, tensions between British settlers and Dutch descendants known as Boers created new conflicts. These tensions eventually led to the Second Boer War. This war demonstrated how competition for land and resources in Africa was not only between Europeans and Africans, but sometimes between different European groups themselves. Germany also entered the colonial race during the late 1800s. Under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck, Germany claimed territories in East Africa and Southwest Africa. German colonial rule often relied on military force. In Southwest Africa, which is now Namibia, German authorities crushed local resistance with extreme violence during the Herero and Nama genocide. Thousands of Herero and Nama people were killed or forced into the desert, where many died from starvation and thirst. Historians consider this one of the earliest genocides of the 20th century. Portugal and Italy also joined the scramble. Portugal maintained control over Angola and Mozambique, territories it had influenced for centuries through coastal trade. Italy attempted to expand into East Africa, though its ambitions were challenged by strong African resistance, especially in Ethiopia. Unlike many African regions that fell quickly to European armies, Ethiopia successfully defended its independence during the Battle of Adwa. Under the leadership of Menelik, the Second Ethiopian forces defeated the Italian army, proving that European colonization was not unstoppable. This victory became a powerful symbol of African resistance and pride. Despite such victories, most African territories were eventually brought under colonial rule. European powers introduced new systems designed to extract resources and maintain control. They built railways, ports, and roads mainly to move raw materials from mines and farms to coastal shipping centers. African labor was often forced or poorly paid. Taxes were imposed that could only be paid with money, forcing people to work in colonial economies instead of traditional agriculture. Colonial administrators also reshaped political systems. Some rulers were removed and replaced with officials loyal to colonial governments. In other cases, Europeans used indirect rule, allowing local leaders to remain in place but forcing them to follow colonial policies. These changes disrupted long-standing social structures and power balances within many communities. Missionaries also played an important role during this period. Many European missionaries believed they were bringing education and religion to Africa. They established schools, churches, and medical centers. While these institutions sometimes provided opportunities for Africans to gain literacy and new skills, they also promoted European cultural values and languages while discouraging traditional beliefs and practices. Over time, the impact of colonization began to reshape African societies in profound ways. Economies shifted toward export crops such as cocoa, coffee, and cotton. New cities emerged around mines and administrative centers. Education systems created a small group of Africans who were trained in European languages and administration. Ironically, this educated group would later become leaders of independence movements during the 20th century. By the early 1900s, the map of Africa had been almost completely transformed. Only two countries remained largely independent. Ethiopia and Liberia stood as rare exceptions in a continent dominated by European empires. Yet beneath the surface of colonial control, resistance continued to grow. Communities resisted forced labor, rejected unfair taxes, and preserved cultural traditions despite colonial pressure. Some rebellions were quickly suppressed, but the desire for freedom never disappeared. The colonization of Africa had created an empire of wealth for European powers, but it had also planted the seeds of future struggles. In the years ahead, these tensions would erupt into revolts, political movements, and a long fight for independence that would eventually change the course of African history forever. As European control spread across the African continent during the late 1800s and early 1900s, colonial governments began building systems that would allow them to control millions of people with relatively small numbers of officials and soldiers. The core goal of colonial rule was not only to occupy land, but to transform African territories into sources of wealth that could benefit European industries and economies. To achieve this, colonial authorities introduced new laws, taxes, labor systems, and administrative structures that changed the lives of African communities in dramatic ways. One of the first tools used by colonial administrations was taxation. Across many colonies, African households were ordered to pay taxes in money rather than goods. For many communities, this was a completely new concept. Traditional economies were often based on farming, local trade, and exchange of goods rather than cash. By demanding taxes in money, colonial governments forced people to enter the colonial economy. Men who previously worked their own land were now pushed to work on plantations, in mines, or on construction projects in order to earn the money needed to pay these taxes. Failure to pay could result in punishment, imprisonment, or confiscation of property. Another powerful tool of control was forced labor. In several colonies, people were ordered to work for colonial authorities for a certain number of days each year. They built roads, railways, government buildings, and ports. These projects helped European powers move resources more efficiently from the interior of Africa to coastal shipping points. While these infrastructure projects were often presented as signs of development, they were mainly designed to serve colonial economic interests rather than the needs of African communities. In French colonies, this system was known as corvée labor. Villagers were required to leave their homes and travel long distances to work on colonial projects under harsh conditions. Many workers suffered from exhaustion, disease, and accidents. In British territories, similar systems existed, although they were sometimes presented as voluntary labor. In reality, many people had little choice but to participate. Colonial economies were designed to focus on the production of specific export crops or resources. In regions suitable for farming, large plantations were established to grow crops such as cocoa, coffee, cotton, and peanuts. These crops were shipped to Europe, where they were processed and sold in international markets. In mineral-rich regions, mining operations expanded rapidly. Copper, gold, diamonds, and other valuable minerals were extracted and exported. African workers were often paid very low wages, while European companies and investors received most of the profits. These economic systems transformed landscapes and communities. Farmers who once grew a variety of crops for local consumption were now encouraged or forced to grow a single cash crop. This change sometimes created food shortages because land that had previously been used for food production was now used for export agriculture. During times of drought or crop failure, these shortages could turn to serious crises. Colonial governments also introduced new political structures. In some regions, Europeans ruled directly through colonial administrators who made decisions about laws, taxes, and policies. In other areas, they used a system called indirect rule. This approach was strongly associated with Frederick Lugard, who governed parts of West Africa. Under indirect rule, local chiefs remained in their positions, but were required to carry out the orders of colonial authorities. These chiefs collected taxes, organized labor, and enforced colonial laws. While this system allowed European governments to maintain control with fewer officials, it also created tensions. Some chiefs gained new powers and privileges, while others lost authority or faced criticism from their communities for cooperating with the colonial rulers. Cultural and social changes also accompanied colonial rule. European missionaries established schools that taught reading, writing, and religious instruction. These schools often used European languages such as English or French rather than local languages. Students learned about European history, religion, and values. While these schools opened opportunities for some Africans to gain education and administrative positions, they also contributed to the erosion of traditional cultural practices and belief systems. At the same time, many Africans adapted creatively to these changes. Educated Africans began forming new social groups and organizations. Some became teachers, clerks, journalists, and lawyers. They used their education to study both European political ideas and African history. Over time, this educated class would play a crucial role in challenging colonial authority. The legal systems introduced by colonial governments often treated Africans and Europeans differently. Europeans living in African colonies usually had access to separate courts and legal protections. Africans were often subject to special laws that limited their rights and freedoms. Movement between regions could require special passes. Political gatherings were sometimes restricted. Newspapers and publications that criticized colonial rule could be censored or banned. Despite these restrictions, resistance to colonial rule appeared in many forms. Some communities resisted through open rebellion. Others used quieter forms of resistance, such as refusing to work, hiding crops, or avoiding colonial tax collectors. Religious movements also became centers of resistance in some areas. Leaders used spiritual authority to inspire followers to challenge colonial control. One of the most dramatic uprisings occurred in German East Africa during the early 1900s. This revolt became known as the Maji Maji Rebellion. The rebellion began when local leaders encouraged communities to resist forced cotton farming imposed by German colonial authorities. Fighters believed that sacred water called Maji would protect them from bullets. Thousands of people joined the uprising, attacking colonial outposts and plantations. However, the German military responded with overwhelming force. Villages were destroyed and crops were burned, leading to widespread famine that killed many civilians. The rebellion was eventually crushed, but it demonstrated the deep anger that colonial policies had created. In southern Africa, resistance also took different forms. Some communities fought armed conflicts against colonial armies, while others organized political movements that demanded rights and representation. These early political movements laid the groundwork for the larger independence struggles that would emerge later in the 20th century. Economic exploitation continued to shape everyday life across the continent. Railways stretched across vast distances, connecting mines and plantations to ports. Cities grew around administrative centers and trading hubs. Workers migrated from rural areas to these new urban centers searching for wages. This movement created new social networks and political awareness among workers who shared experiences of colonial rule. By the early 1900s, colonial empires appeared powerful and stable. European powers controlled almost every region of Africa, and colonial governments seemed firmly established. Yet beneath the surface, tensions were building. Educated Africans were beginning to question why their countries were ruled by foreign powers. Workers demanded better wages and working conditions. Farmers struggled against taxes and forced crop systems. Religious leaders and intellectuals spoke about dignity, identity, and freedom. The seeds of resistance were spreading quietly but steadily across the continent. The colonization of Africa had reshaped economies, societies, and political systems in ways that would affect generations to come. But the story of colonial rule was far from finished. The next chapter would reveal how African resistance movements grew stronger and more organized. setting the stage for a long struggle that would eventually challenge the power of the colonial empires. By the early 1900s, the colonial system across Africa looked powerful and firmly established. Yet beneath the surface, something important was beginning to change. Across cities, villages, and trading centers, a new generation of Africans was slowly gaining education, political awareness, and a deeper understanding of the systems that rule their lives. Missionary schools and colonial training institutions had unintentionally created a group of educated Africans who could read global news, understand political ideas, and question the authority of colonial governments. These individuals became teachers, clerks, lawyers, journalists, and religious leaders. Many of them began asking a dangerous question. If Europeans spoke constantly about freedom, justice, and democracy, why were Africans denied these same rights in their own lands? This question slowly spread across the continent and began to influence the thinking of communities that had endured decades of colonial control. In West Africa, educated Africans started forming political associations and discussion groups where they debated the future of their societies. Newspapers written by African journalists appeared in cities such as Lagos, Accra, and Freetown. These publications criticized unfair colonial policies, demanded better representation in government, and encouraged Africans to think about self-rule. While colonial authorities sometimes tried to suppress these voices, the ideas continued to circulate widely. Similar developments were happening in East and Southern Africa, where workers, farmers, and teachers began organizing movements that demanded reforms. One important influence during this period was the growth of Pan-African thought. This movement encouraged people of African descent across the world to unite and support the liberation of Africa from colonial rule. Leaders such as W.E.B. Du Bois helped organize conferences that brought together intellectuals from Africa, the Caribbean, and the United States. These gatherings discussed the impact of colonialism and the possibility of political independence for African nations. Although these ideas initially spread among small groups of educated elites, they slowly inspired wider political awareness among ordinary people. World events also played a powerful role in changing African attitudes toward colonial rule. During the First World War, thousands of African soldiers were recruited to fight in European armies. They served in battles both within Africa and in distant regions such as Europe and the Middle East. Many of these soldiers experienced the contradictions of colonial rule firsthand. They fought bravely for European empires, yet when they returned home, they were still treated as subjects without political rights. This experience deepened the feeling among many Africans that the colonial system was unjust. The war also weakened several European powers economically and politically. After the conflict ended, some colonial territories that had belonged to Germany were taken over by Britain, France, and Belgium under a system created by the League of Nations. Although this system claimed to prepare territories for self-governance in the future, real power still remained firmly in European hands. Economic hardships during the 1920s and 1930s also affected colonial Africa. Global economic crises such as the Great Depression caused severe drops in the prices of export crops and minerals. African farmers who depended on selling products like cocoa or cotton suddenly found that their incomes had collapsed. At the same time, colonial taxes remained high. This situation created deep frustration and hardship in many communities. Workers in mines and plantations also faced poor conditions and low wages. As a result, strikes and protests began appearing more frequently across several colonies. These actions were often met with arrests and repression by colonial authorities. Yet each protest helped spread the idea that organized resistance could challenge the system. Education continued to play a central role in shaping the future leadership of African independence movements. Universities and schools began producing graduates who understood law, economics, and politics. Some traveled abroad to study in Europe or America, where they encountered global debates about freedom and human rights. When these students returned home, they carried new ideas about nationalism and political organization. One of the most important changes during this period was the growth of African nationalism. Nationalism encouraged people to think of themselves not only as members of local tribes or communities, but as citizens of larger nations that deserved independence. Political parties began forming in several regions with the goal of ending colonial rule through negotiation or organized resistance. In British West Africa, for example, leaders started demanding constitutional reforms that would allow Africans to participate in government decision-making. Colonial officials often responded slowly to these demands, offering small concessions while trying to maintain ultimate control. Meanwhile, new communication networks helped spread political awareness more quickly than before. Railways and roads connected distant regions. Newspapers circulated ideas across colonies. Workers traveling between towns shared stories about injustices and resistance movements. Churches and religious gatherings also became places where people discussed social and political issues affecting their communities. As the decades passed, the demand for change became stronger. When the Second World War began, thousands of African soldiers were again recruited to fight alongside European forces. Many African territories also supplied food, minerals, and other resources needed for the war effort. Yet once again, Africans were asked to sacrifice for empires that denied them political freedom. By the end of the war, global attitudes toward colonialism were beginning to shift. The war had weakened many European economies, making it harder to maintain large overseas empires. At the same time, the creation of the United Nations introduced new global discussions about human rights and the principle of self-determination for nations. African leaders quickly recognized that the international environment was changing. Across the continent, political movements grew more confident and more organized. In North Africa, nationalist movements demanded independence from French and British control. In West Africa, political parties mobilized large numbers of supporters. In East and Southern Africa, workers and farmers continued organizing strikes and protests against colonial authorities. Although colonial governments still possessed military power, the moral and political foundation of colonial rule was beginning to weaken. Many Africans were no longer willing to accept foreign domination as permanent or inevitable. They believed that the future of their countries should be decided by their own people. The stage was now set for the next phase of Africa's long struggle for freedom. What had started as small conversations among educated elites was evolving into powerful national movements that would soon challenge the authority of colonial empires across the entire continent. By the middle of the 20th century, the pressure against colonial rule in Africa had grown stronger than ever before. The Second World War had ended, and the global political landscape was changing rapidly. European powers that once seemed invincible were now weakened by years of war, economic hardship, and political instability. Across Africa, millions of people had contributed to the war effort, either by fighting as soldiers or by supplying labor and resources that helped the Allied forces achieve victory. When the war ended, many Africans believed that the promises of freedom and democracy spoken about during the conflict should now apply to them as well. However, colonial governments were slow to grant real independence. Instead, they attempted to maintain control while offering limited political reforms. This hesitation only increased the determination of African nationalists who believed that the time for complete independence had arrived. Political organizations began growing rapidly in many parts of the continent. In cities, large crowds gathered at rallies where leaders spoke about freedom, dignity, and the right of Africans to govern their own lands. Newspapers printed speeches that challenged colonial authority. Workers formed unions that demanded better wages and working conditions. Students organized protests in universities and schools. These movements were no longer small discussions among elites. They had become mass movements supported by farmers, workers, traders, and intellectuals across entire colonies. One of the earliest successes of the independence movement occurred in West Africa. The British colony known as the Gold Coast became the center of intense political activism. So a young leader named Kwame Nkrumah emerged as one of the most powerful voices demanding self-rule. Nkrumah organized rallies and campaigns that mobilized thousands of ordinary people. His message was clear and direct. Africans must control their own political and economic destiny. After years of political pressure, negotiations, and civil resistance, the Gold Coast achieved independence in 1957 and became the nation of Ghana. This event was historic. It marked the first time a British colony in sub-Saharan Africa gained independence through a mass nationalist movement. The victory inspired people across the continent who saw it as proof that colonial rule could be defeated. Similar movements soon gained strength in other regions. In French West Africa, nationalist leaders began pushing for greater political autonomy. France initially attempted to maintain influence by creating a system where colonies could remain connected to the French community while gaining some self-governance. However, many African leaders believed that partial autonomy was not enough. They demanded full independence. Meanwhile, in North Africa, struggles for independence often took a more violent form. In Algeria, a long and brutal conflict erupted between French colonial forces and nationalist fighters. This conflict, known as the Algerian War of Independence, became one of the most intense anti-colonial wars of the 20th century. The war caused enormous suffering, but eventually forced France to recognize Algerian independence. In Central Africa, the process of decolonization also accelerated. The vast territory of the Belgian Congo had been ruled by Belgium for decades with very little preparation for self-government. As nationalist movements began forming there, tensions between different political groups increased rapidly. One of the most prominent leaders who emerged during this period was Patrice Lumumba. Lumumba spoke passionately about unity and independence. He believed that the Congo should remain a single nation where all ethnic groups worked together. His speeches attracted large audiences and made him a powerful symbol of resistance against colonial rule. In 1960, Belgium finally granted independence to the Congo. However, the transition was chaotic and unstable. Political divisions, foreign interests, and military rebellions quickly plunged the new nation into crisis. Although Lumumba became the first prime minister of the independent Congo, his government faced enormous challenges and external pressures that would soon lead to tragedy. In East Africa, independence movements were also gaining momentum. Nationalist leaders organized political parties that represented the hopes of millions of people who wanted an end to colonial domination. In Kenya, a violent uprising known as the Mau Mau Uprising challenged British authority. The rebellion began mainly among members of the Kikuyu community who had lost land to European settlers. Although the uprising was eventually suppressed by British forces, it forced the colonial government to reconsider its policies. Kenya eventually achieved independence in 1963. Southern Africa presented a more complex situation. In some territories, large populations of European settlers controlled political power and resisted independence movements. These settler governments feared losing economic privileges and land ownership. As a result, struggles for freedom in this region would continue for many more years. Yet even there, nationalist organizations were growing stronger. Across Africa, the independence movement was not only political but also cultural. Artists, writers, and musicians began celebrating African identity and history. They rejected the colonial idea that African cultures were inferior. Instead, they highlighted the richness of African languages, traditions, and knowledge. This cultural revival strengthened the confidence of people who had long been told that their societies needed European guidance. International support also played an important role in the independence era. Newly independent countries in Asia and the Middle East often supported African nationalist movements. Global organizations such as the United Nations provided forums where colonial issues could be debated before the world. Many leaders argued that colonialism violated the principle of self-determination. As these arguments gained global attention, European governments faced increasing pressure to grant independence to their colonies. By the early 1960s, a wave of independence swept across Africa. Country after country gained sovereignty and established national governments. The political map of the continent changed rapidly as colonial empires dissolved. Yet the end of colonial rule did not solve every problem. Many newly independent nations faced challenges such as economic dependence on former colonial powers, internal political conflicts, and borders that had been drawn without regard to ethnic or cultural realities. These difficulties would shape the next phase of African history. Despite these challenges, the achievement of independence represented a powerful moment of hope and transformation. After decades of colonial domination, Africans were finally taking control of their political future. The struggles, sacrifices, and dreams of countless individuals had made this moment possible. The continent was entering a new era where the question was no longer whether colonial rule would end, but how African nations would build their own paths forward in a rapidly changing world. By the early 1960s, the political map of Africa was changing at a speed that surprised even the most optimistic supporters of independence. European empires that had dominated the continent for decades were beginning to collapse one after another. Countries that had once been controlled by distant colonial governments were now raising their own flags and forming national administrations led by African leaders. For millions of people across the continent, these were moments filled with excitement, pride, and hope for a better future. Crowds gathered in city squares to celebrate independence ceremonies. Music, speeches, and parades marked the end of foreign rule. Yet behind the celebrations, many leaders understood that independence was only the beginning of a much more difficult journey. The legacy of colonial rule had left deep economic, political, and social challenges that would not disappear overnight. One of the first difficulties faced by newly independent nations was economic dependence. Colonial economies had been designed mainly to supply raw materials to European industries. Mines produced minerals such as copper, gold, and diamonds. Farms produced export crops such as cocoa, cotton, coffee, and peanuts. These resources were exported overseas where they were processed and sold at higher value. As a result, many African countries entered independence with economies that depended heavily on a small number of exports. This made them vulnerable to changes in global prices and international demand. Leaders quickly realized that building stronger and more diverse economies would require long-term planning, education, and infrastructure. Political stability also became a major challenge. Colonial authorities had often drawn national borders without considering the cultural and ethnic realities of the people living within those regions. Many new countries contained dozens of ethnic groups with different languages, traditions, and historical rivalries. During colonial rule, these differences had sometimes been manipulated by administrators who favored certain groups over others. After independence, these tensions sometimes resurfaced as different political factions competed for power. In several countries, disagreements over leadership led to political crises and military coups. One of the most tragic examples of this instability occurred in the newly independent Congo. After independence in 1960, the country quickly descended into the Congo crisis. Regional leaders attempted to break away from the central government, while foreign powers became involved because of the country's valuable mineral resources. The situation eventually led to the overthrow and death of Patrice Lumumba, whose dream of a united nation was cut short by internal conflict and international interference. Despite such tragedies, many African leaders continued working tirelessly to build strong nations. They invested in education systems that could train new generations of teachers, engineers, doctors, and administrators. Schools and universities expanded rapidly across the continent. Leaders believed that education was the key to overcoming the economic and social limitations left behind by colonial rule. Infrastructure development also became a priority. Governments built roads, hospitals, dams, and communication networks that could support national growth. In some countries, ambitious agricultural and industrial projects were launched in the hope of transforming colonial economies into self-sufficient systems. Another important development during this period was the effort to promote unity among African nations. Many leaders believed that the legacy of colonial borders had divided the continent in ways that weakened its global influence. To address this concern, several countries worked together to form the Organization of African Unity. The goal of this organization was to promote cooperation between African states, support liberation movements in territories that were still under colonial or minority rule, and encourage peaceful resolution of conflicts between member countries. Although the organization faced many challenges, it represented a powerful symbol of the shared vision for African solidarity and independence. While many countries had achieved independence during the 1960s, parts of the continent were still struggling under colonial or minority rule. In southern Africa, the fight for freedom continued for several more decades. In territories such as Angola and Mozambique, nationalist movements fought long wars against Portuguese colonial authorities. These conflicts lasted many years and caused immense suffering for civilians caught between opposing forces. Eventually, both countries achieved independence in the 1970s after Portugal itself underwent political changes that ended its colonial empire. The struggle in South Africa was even more complex. There, a system known as apartheid allowed a minority white government to maintain strict control over the majority black population. Laws restricted where people could live, work, and travel based on race. Political rights were denied to most citizens. Resistance movements grew steadily as activists organized protests, strikes, and international campaigns against the system. One of the most famous leaders of this struggle was Nelson Mandela. Mandela and many other activists were imprisoned for years because of their efforts to challenge apartheid. Despite this repression, the movement for equality continued to grow both within South Africa and around the world. The late 20th century eventually brought major changes to Southern Africa. International pressure, economic challenges, and internal resistance forced the apartheid government to begin negotiations with opposition leaders. In 1994, South Africa held its first democratic elections, in which citizens of all races could vote. Nelson Mandela was elected as the country's first black president, marking a historic moment that symbolized the end of one of the last major systems of colonial-style racial domination in Africa. By the end of the 20th century, the age of European colonial rule in Africa had officially ended. Every country on the continent had achieved independence and established its own national government. Yet the impact of colonization continued to influence political systems, economic structures, and international relationships. The challenge for African nations was now to transform their independence into lasting stability, prosperity, and unity. Many leaders and citizens remained determined to achieve this goal despite the obstacles they faced. The story of colonization had begun with foreign powers dividing a vast continent in pursuit of wealth and influence. It had continued through decades of resistance, suffering, and determination. Now, the final chapter of this documentary will explore the lasting legacy of colonial rule and how Africa continues to shape its future in a world that is still influenced by the decisions made during those earlier centuries. Welcome back to Untold Reality Daily. As we reach the final chapter of today's documentary, we must look at the long shadow left behind by the era of colonization in Africa. The story of how the West colonized Africa did not end when the colonial flags were lowered and independence was declared. The effects of those years continued to shape the politics, economies, and societies of African nations even today. To understand the present, we must carefully examine what remained after the colonial powers left and how African people began rebuilding their future on foundations that had been deeply altered by decades of foreign control. When independence movements succeeded across Africa during the 1950s and 1960s, the moment felt like the beginning of a new chapter filled with promise. Leaders spoke about unity, development, and the dream of building strong nations that could stand proudly among the countries of the world. Crowds celebrated in the streets as new national flags were raised and colonial administrators prepared to leave. Yet the challenges waiting for these new governments were far greater than many people had imagined. Colonial rule had changed Africa's political structures, economic systems, and even the borders that defined each nation. Those borders had originally been drawn during the Berlin Conference. They often ignored ethnic groups, traditional kingdoms, and long-established cultural regions. As a result, many independent nations contained diverse populations that had different histories and political interests. Managing these differences required careful leadership and strong institutions, something that many young countries were still trying to build. Another major challenge involved the structure of colonial economies. During the colonial era, most African territories had been designed to serve European industries. Railways connected mines and plantations to ports rather than linking African communities to one another. Factories and advanced industries were rare because colonial authorities preferred exporting raw materials instead of developing local manufacturing. When independence arrived, many African governments inherited economies that depended heavily on exporting a few commodities, such as cocoa, coffee, oil, or minerals. If global prices dropped, national income could fall quickly. This economic vulnerability made development difficult and forced many countries to rely on international loans or foreign investment. Political tensions also appeared in several nations as leaders struggled to maintain unity and stability. Some governments faced opposition from groups that felt excluded from power. In other cases, the military stepped into politics, arguing that it could restore order or prevent chaos. As a result, a number of African countries experienced coups during the decades following independence. These events sometimes interrupted democratic progress and created new political challenges. However, it is important to remember that many African nations also made significant achievements during this time. Universities were built, healthcare systems expanded, and major infrastructure projects were launched. Millions of children gained access to education for the first time. African writers, scientists, artists, and leaders began contributing their voices to global discussions about culture, science, and politics. Regional cooperation also continued to grow. The Organization of African Unity encouraged African states to work together in solving conflicts and supporting liberation movements in territories that were still under foreign control. Decades later, this organization evolved into the African Union, which continues working toward economic integration, peacekeeping, and development across the continent. The legacy of colonial rule also influenced global politics during the Cold War period. Both Western and Eastern powers attempted to build alliances with newly independent African countries. Some governments received economic or military support from foreign nations that hoped to gain influence in the region. While this support sometimes provided resources for development, it also created situations where African political struggles became connected to larger global rivalries. Despite these pressures, African leaders continued searching for ways to strengthen their independence and protect their sovereignty. The cultural impact of colonization also left lasting marks. European languages such as English, French, and Portuguese remained widely used in government, education, and international communication. At the same time, African communities worked to preserve and celebrate their own languages, traditions, and histories. Writers, filmmakers, historians, and musicians began telling stories that highlighted the resilience and creativity of African societies. These cultural movements helped restore pride in identities that had often been dismissed during the colonial period. In recent decades, many African countries have experienced significant economic growth and technological development. Cities have expanded rapidly, new industries have emerged, and young entrepreneurs are creating innovations in fields such as technology, agriculture, and finance. While challenges remain, there is also a strong sense of determination among millions of Africans who are shaping the future of their continent with new ideas and ambitions. Looking back at the history of colonization allows us to understand how deeply the past can influence the present. The story of how the West colonized Africa is not simply a story about conquest and power. It is also a story about resistance, survival, and the determination of people who refuse to accept permanent domination. Generations of Africans challenged colonial rule in different ways. Some fought in rebellions, others organized political movements, wrote powerful speeches, or educated new leaders who would continue the struggle for freedom. Their efforts eventually transformed the political map of the world and ended one of the largest colonial systems in human history. Today, the continent of Africa stands as a collection of independent nations with diverse cultures, languages, and ambitions. The journey toward stability and prosperity continues, shaped by both the lessons of history and the hopes of future generations. Understanding this history is important not only for Africans, but for people everywhere. It reminds us how decisions made by powerful nations can affect millions of lives, and how the courage of ordinary people can eventually change the course of history. And with that, we come to the end of today's powerful documentary on how the West colonized Africa. Thank you for watching Untold Reality Daily. If you found this story informative and eye-opening, please support our channel by liking this video and subscribing if you have not already done so. Your support helps us continue bringing you untold stories from history that deserve to be remembered. Before you leave, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Share your city and country so we can see how far this story has traveled around the world. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep exploring the untold realities of history.